I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast, part 2 of our multi-part series.
On Journey to the West.
We are journeying westward,
Westward, young folks, people. Yes, so part 2. Part 1 of this series, we kind of introduced the work and why it matters that we're doing a multi-part series just on one work. Because this one has a pretty huge impact, pretty huge influence on literature all over Asia.
I have argued that it's the most influential novel in Asian literature. Not necessarily Chinese literature.
Right.
But Asian literature because of the effect that it has outside of China. I mean, it's very popular within China. Sure. I don't want to try and minimize that, but I think Hong Lo Meng, the Dream of the Red Chamber, is probably more influential in terms of Chinese literature.
Definitely holds that crown within China.
But Xiuji, Journey to the West, it's more influential outside of China.
Yeah. And we talked a lot about why it matters that it is that way, some of the ideas in the novel. We want to get a little more into the novel itself. So the next couple of podcasts, you're going to get an introduction to the content of the novel.
Specific passages.
And also kind of how to read it, because we talked about this as well in the last podcast. Without some kind of guide for how to appreciate what's going on, it gets boring fast.
Really boring.
Because it's the same kind of adventure over and over again. But we also pointed out it's the same kind of adventure over and over again, the same way it's the same kind of murder mystery over and over again in some of the most popular series.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of like car chases or Western or any other sort of genre that maybe isn't the most kind of thought-provoking.
Right.
You get the same stuff, but people continue enjoying it.
Yeah, if you enjoy that scenario, watching the little tweaks and twists and turns they put on a formula is the appeal, right? We're going to talk this week about the first 7 chapters, which I'm going to say are the most well-known from the entire novel.
Yeah.
Which is the rebellion against heaven. This is the introduction of the Monkey King, Sun Wukong, into the story, and how he comes to be attached later on in the novel to this very boring monk heading west to get the scriptures.
And you just mentioned monkey is named Sun Wukong. We should point out that he has multiple names. Pilgrim, quite a few. He picks up quite a few names while traveling. We're just going to call him either monkey or Sun Wukong.
Right. I may slip up and call him Monkey King because that's how I heard him called all over my time in China. But
we've already talked today a little bit about how formulaic the novel is, and we don't mean that as an insult. It's just kind of a statement of fact. These first 7 chapters are the least formulaic part of the novel.
And it's the one that if you've read enough in the Western canon, you will resonate with the most because it resembles very strongly Satan's rebellion against heaven and Milton's Paradise Lost. You have a similar character, chaotic, powerful, refusing to submit to anyone else's will.
He's sort of heavenly. He's kind of formed out of this rock.
Let me just see if I can break it down real quick, just the plot, because I don't want to, if we try to summarize all the ins and outs here, it'll take a long time to summarize. In Anthony Yu's translation, the novel begins at the very beginning, like the creation of the universe and the powers and all that stuff. But the introduction to Monkey or Monkey King is there's a heavenly stone on Earth, out of which breaks this monkey, this stone monkey. And he cavorts with the other monkeys on this island. And one day they're playing next to a lake. One of them says, "Hey, I wonder what's on the other side of this waterfall. Whoever can go there and come back will be our king." Monkey does. He goes through the waterfall, finds a whole heavenly realm, comes back and is made king. Over the course of the next several chapters, he goes from being just a king to a sage, someone who goes to study with a Taoist adept. All the various transformational magics and stuff that the Taoists are supposed to know.
He gains the ability to transform himself. He fights a dragon king. He's famous for his stick that can grow to however long he needs it to.
Or big.
And he can put it behind his ear and then whip it out.
He can travel millions of miles with one leap.
And it's kind of very science fiction-y in the way that this novel sometimes is about like toys.
Very much so.
What
eventually happens is he gains all these powers from a Taoist priest, but he's arrogant. And the priest knows it, and partly the reason he's cast out is his arrogance. And it's also what leads Sun Wukong to go, hang on a second, I'm really great. Why do I have to just stay here?
Why do I have to take orders from others?
I'm not taking orders from anybody. And over the course of the next few chapters, first he's invited up to the heavenly realms to serve in the bureaucracy there, decides it's beneath him, rebels against that, and basically anything that the various higher-ups in the heavenly bureaucracy try to do to corral him, he overthrows to the point where he causes an actual almost revolution in heaven itself.
He literally almost
overthrows it.
I was going to say literally overthrows it, but he really undercuts it. Quite literally, he almost knocks out the foundation for heaven, and heaven itself almost falls apart. And this is, we can talk more about the importance of kind of the political ramifications of
right.
that.
He is, of course, eventually imprisoned by one of the most powerful beings in the heavenly realms. He is imprisoned under a mountain.
He's eaten a peach, so he can't die. There's an immortal peach, so he can't die. Again, the sort of science-y, fiction-y kind of
He is demanded to be called the great sage under heaven.
The Emperor King of Heaven himself throws his best guys at Monkey King and tries to fight Monkey King to a standstill. But Monkey resists most of them. He eventually gets beaten.
Right. And he's imprisoned. And that's where the chapters end. And he is told that eventually there will be someone who comes around and he will have to serve as that person's master in order to redeem himself. This is an interesting twist on this sort of story because you have a character who refuses to recognize any authority, arrogant, powerful, annoying sometimes.
Really annoying.
Really annoying sometimes. What's interesting is chapter 7, which is when he's finally subdued and imprisoned. It's an open book, literally. But every reader of the book knows that this is chapter 7. This is only chapter 7. What's going to happen with this character later in the novel?
These first 7 chapters really almost form a novel unto themselves. They
if you
kind of have
stop
a narrative
at chapter
arc.
7, you could almost separate this thing into like a series, and book 1 would be 1 to 7.
It's my understanding that we don't actually know the provenance of different parts of this novel, and there is a possibility. It's my understanding there is a possibility that chapters 1 through 7 came from a different source, and that this whole novel was kind of stitched together from different sources. And certainly going back and rereading this novel, it felt a little bit like 1 through 7 was this completely different thing. Do you remember, Rob, I know you're not a huge fan of Harry Potter.
I love Harry Potter. Are you kidding me?
Okay, good. We're on the same page. I can't believe we haven't had this conversation. So I love Harry Potter as well. One of the things that the listener may have noticed, but without realizing it, is in that first book, there are almost 2 books in Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, or Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. There's this kind of narrative arc to the first maybe like fourth of the book, where the period before he goes to Hogwarts, and then there's another story that kind of while he's at Hogwarts. And the reason for that is because J.K. Rowling actually wrote the first fourth of the book and like sent it out to different sources, and she eventually got funding, I believe. So those are 2 separate novels that are stitched together real well. So if you want to think about Shioji, Journey to the West, and how and what it means, and this is a technical term, we try not to use too many technical terms. We may use a couple in this podcast. The technical word I'm going to use is syncretic. That just means kind of pieced together from different parts, Frankenstein style. If you're thinking about this novel as kind of similar to Harry Potter in that way, that might help the listener understand it some.
Now, I would add, though, to the Harry Potter reference that the difference here is that these first 7 chapters don't have any equal in the rest of the novel in terms of excitement, action, intrigue. This is the high point that he stitched. It's almost as though if he was in the same situation as J.K. Rowling, he's like, if I'm going to get funding, I'm going to have to come out of the gate swinging. And these first 7 chapters were him coming out swinging.
They're really good.
And really, seriously, the first 7 chapters you will enjoy. I mean, there's a lot of just really arcane Buddhist terminology. I don't know what it means
and Taoist terminology.
And Taoist terminology and all that.
You don't know what it means, Rob, because you're in comparative literature.
I'm comparative lit. We don't really care about disciplinary integrity.
But the times that you should have been spending studying these Buddhist terms, you were actually learning French.
I was reading high theory and all that. That's right. Just wasting my academic youth on high theory. That's such an academic joke. Half the people who listen to this podcast are going to go, what?
I think most of our listeners are into those kind of academic jokes.
Or at least have been a part of it, yeah.
If you do love our nerdy jokes, let us know.
Please.
Send us a comment.
And we'll give you more. We'll throw more in there. But
email us, please.
Right. No, but it's interesting because to read a novel that basically can't ever match up to its first 7 chapters in terms of everything, really. I mean, yes, it is. A lot of the rest of the novel can be as interesting in terms of ideas, but the character of the Monkey King is most himself here. So arguably, he never really 100% changes from this point. He's kind of forced to serve, and he does so, but these first 7 chapters, Lee's giving me a head shake. He's forced to serve, and he does serve, but not willingly, through the rest of the novel. We'll talk about that later.
So I disagree that Monkey never changes. I think this whole novel is about Monkey's change, and it's that narrative arc. This is Monkey if you read this as a Buddhist, as a kind of Buddhist allegory, as a Buddhist kind of Pilgrim's Progress, if you will, which is how Anthony Yu encourages. I don't think he said Pilgrim's Progress, but he is reading it as a Buddhist allegory, as a religious text. Anthony Yu is. If you read it as an allegory for Buddhism, then Monkey really does change. He has this profound change, and it's an important religious change. Now, I will say this. No part of the novel is as exciting as these first 7 chapters in the sort of action thriller kind of thing. I kind of think of these first 7 chapters as like an action movie that is spun off for a television series.
Or if you've ever seen an action movie where the first 10 minutes are this ridiculous chase scene, explosions, gunfire, and then for the next like 20 minutes, you're in like a government
like
office
plot.
somewhere. Yeah, it's that. It's kind of thing. Now, the other thing about this, though, is there is something perennially fascinating, popular about this kind of character. Yeah. The kind of character who is completely outside of everything, knows how it works, but just doesn't care. Says, you know what, that works for you.
Flip-flop.
I don't care. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do my thing. You can't make me. Every culture in history has had this feeling of, I feel like I'm being forced to do things against my will and I don't want to do them. I still have to do them, obviously. Well, what if you didn't? And that's the whole appeal in these first 7 chapters, is a character who not even heaven can control. Imagine if the powers that created the universe couldn't even really stop you.
And just barely stopped him in the end.
Just barely stopped
him. It's only when Lao Tzu, so Monkey and all of the heavenly creatures are fighting, and Monkey holds all of them off.
Sure.
And it's only when Lao Tzu tricks him that he actually is captured. And it's not through physical strength, but it's through guile.
And I'll point this out too. One of the things that I've always found weird about superhero stories, of which this is absolutely one.
Definitely.
Is the arbitrary limits on their power. So if you've ever seen or read Watchmen by Alan Moore, the character of Dr. Manhattan is a god. Like, can do anything anywhere, can stop time, can do anything to anyone, right? And you're reading this, and the whole time I'm reading, I'm like, why does he act the way he does then? Because it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. He can literally do anything. Well, imagine a character who did do anything he wanted to. Pure will, pure desire, right? That's all he does.
Monkey represents kind of the id, or just in Buddhist terms, he represents anger, like the human compulsion towards anger.
Yeah. Nietzsche would have had a lot of fun with Monkey, someone who acts not based on a long-term plan. He's all impulse. He's all spontaneity. Like, I think I'll just do this, and we'll just see what happens, right? There's something much more believable about that than a superhero with some incredible power who just seems to not use it sometimes, but also some other times. Yeah. I can already hear some comic studies people frothing over this, but I'm not a scholar in that field either. But it's interesting to see a character with this much power with the gloves off. Like, nothing restrains him, and so he doesn't restrain himself. He just does whatever, you know?
You mentioned that every culture has this kind of character with the gloves off who just doesn't care.
Right.
I want to point something out. I'm not sure Chinese culture has this kind of character before really Monkey appears on the scene. Maybe you could argue that Shui Hu Zhuan, the Water Margins novel, is something like that. And I'll say that in connection to another point that I want to make, which is one of the reasons that this novel is so successful and so beloved is because it's so unlike anything that comes before it in Chinese literature. And I actually, and this is kind of controversial, a position that a theory I have, it's not based in, it's not very well based in the evidence, but it's a hunch I have, essentially, that lots of the elements of this novel are actually drawn from possibly Indic stories transmitted via Buddhism along the Silk Road. Of course, Buddhism originates in India. It dies out in India as it travels to China. The stories associated with Buddhism also oftentimes travel from India to China and come to China in different forms through travelers and stories and things like that. The same way that the text itself, which this novel is about, which we're going to get into in the next episode, travels to China. These stories come to China. So Monkey, it's no surprise that Monkey kind of looks like Hanuman from Indian epics. He's this bad boy who doesn't really care about things, gets in trouble a lot of times. This is something that's just my theory. It's not provable, but I do really think that a lot of these elements, the elements of the story, are drawn from this, are less kind of created and more of translated along the Silk Road to China.
Well, and I think there's something to that, because by this point, of course, Buddhism has already been in China for what, 7 centuries, 8 centuries? It enters China in the Tang Dynasty.
Well, this is written in I think it's published in the late 16th century, so like 1580s, yes. 1590s, something like that. Buddhism came to China in just after the Han Dynasty. I think earliest it came was in the late Han.
Okay,
or early.
I'm off in my chronology.
Yeah, more than a millennium. Yeah, you're way off. But then again, you are comparative literature.
That's true. Thank you for pointing that out. Yeah, if we ever talk about Jacques Derrida, I'll correct you. But
that's why we're never going to talk about Jacques Derrida.
So I never have a handle. Anyway, but what's interesting about that is it's long enough now that a lot of these themes are internalized.
The Buddhism has been internalized into a Chinese...
And there's enough room to combine that in, say it with me now, syncretic fashion with older, because the martial arts genre of writing is extremely old in China.
Yeah. It goes back pretty much to the beginning of the writing of history in China.
Yes, it's super old.
I think we did a podcast on Sima Qian's story of Nie Zheng, which is kind of the beginning point of martial arts.
Or at least the beginning of it being codified. The stories were circulating before that. But anyway, so it makes total sense to have two different lines of storytelling for someone to go, why not just combine those, though? Yeah. Why not? And again, we keep bringing this up, and I'll keep on bringing this up because I think it's important. The parallels with our superhero stories that we tell, something like the Avengers, I was thinking about this just this morning, and I'm not really sure why, but the idea that the Avengers includes as one of the heroes Thor, who's a member of an actual cultural pantheon of gods. So superheroes and then Thor, an actual god, right? Together. So there's a lot of this going on all over the place. The idea of this is a religious theme over here. This is, superhero fiction over here. Let's bring them together. It has made sense before, right? That's Journey to the West. That's these first 7 chapters. And I think what I was going to add to that, and then you can jump on this. What's interesting about your notion of this being sort of a Buddhist import or an Indian import is that it also helps explain why all the gloves are off, right? Because Shui Hu Zhuan, the water margin, which is written shortly before this, also 16th century, these are characters in that novel who also operate outside the margins, but they have a code. A code of behavior that holds them together, like a code of honor, of ethics. They're not necessarily pure will because they're not being filtered through a Buddhist lens. Like in order to have a character who's transformed, they should start out being the worst possible version of their own urges, which is exactly what Monkey is. And then at least theoretically, they are changed. You and I can disagree about that. I tend to think that doesn't happen until the last 2 pages of the novel. But anyway,
you're wrong.
Okay, fair enough. Not fair enough. You're wrong. But anyway, this combination is important because it's also what makes this novel international and not just a Chinese creation.
Yeah. I think that's a great place to end it.
Okay, stay tuned for other episodes. Also, as always, make sure you give us a shout out on Twitter, Instagram. On Twitter, we're Chinlit Pod, Chinese Literature Podcast. Instagram, Chinese Lit Pod. And, of course, we should just stop calling it Patreon and just start calling it Beerion or something. Chinese Literature Podcast. Also, if you haven't already, subscribe. It makes us look good if we have subscribers.
Leave us a review on your podcasting, your favorite podcasting app. We appreciate that.
Tell us how brilliant we are. No negative reviews, please. Only good ones.
You can review Rob negative.
3.5 stars. I would have given it 5 if Lee was doing a monologue anyway. But yeah, we'll stop there. In the next couple of episodes will be more content from the novel.
Yeah.
We'll be giving you a little more about how to appreciate this, who the characters are, and perhaps most interestingly, how it ends.
Yeah. All right. I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.